and super happy that that I get to share a little bit about my passion today, which is the intersection between Fabric and Power Platform. Before we get too far, just you already said most of the most important things. My name is Jon, based in Copenhagen, Denmark, and I run a little blog on the side of my consulting work called Downhill Data, and you can also find me on LinkedIn. So if you find any of the things that I'm talking about today interesting, maybe you have questions you don't dare ask to me in the chat or something like that, feel free to reach out. I'd love to discuss these topics with you. Just briefly about the topic today and what you can expect. I loaded up the backpack with a bunch of cool things that all relate to this integration between Power Apps and Fabric, but most specifically, we're going to be talking a lot about the direct integration between Power Apps and Fabric SQL Databases. How do we integrate that? How does that look in a write-back scenario in which we want to do data manipulation from within a Power BI report? And then I have a lot of cool extra advanced integrations depending on how we're doing on time that I'll show you. Regarding stored procedures and some hacks to make your Power Apps behave better when they are embedded in Power BI and stuff like that. But the center focus of the presentation and where we'll spend the bulk of our effort today is on the integration between Fabric SQL Databases and Power Apps. So why should you bother with this integration and with write back to Fabric? And I think there are many ways to approach this topic, but I'd like to start it with jumping into Fabric and show you a little bit about what it's about. So let me just jump into my browser here. I've loaded up a small report here, which I hope you're all able to see. This is a report that pulls data from a Fabric SQL database. I've just loaded the standard Microsoft Contoso demo data set, built a nondescript report that you shouldn't pay too much attention to. But the right-hand side of the report here is where the magic happens, right? So this is a Power BI report, but these three visuals here are all Power Apps for Power BI visuals with Power Apps integrated into them. So each of these boxes is a window into the Power Platform, into a Power App that serves as a kind of extension to Microsoft Fabric. In this case, I have two different write-back applications, which is what we'll spend the majority of the time on today. And I'll demo it for you in a second. And then I have a little ChatGPT extension as well, just for the heck of it. And these 2 minutes of showing off here is just to sort of make you care about this integration. Why should you care about integrating Power Apps and Fabric, specifically SQL databases? So if I navigate through my little hierarchy of Contoso data here, I can arrive at some piece of total sales by country, product, and email here. And you'll notice that once I clicked on this one person right here, my top right Power App started showing some data. And this is one way we can use Power Apps embedded in Power BI reports, is that we can connect to the underlying data source, in this case, a Fabric SQL database, and we can show data from the Fabric SQL database within the Power App itself. So here I've logged a comment saying carry on sales are high. We can add a little comment here saying this was from the Fabric online conference, just to show that we can update this comment as well. Now, if I navigate away, it's gone. Go back to it, you can see it's still there. And this kind of annotation app is a very, very common add-in or extension that I like to build into my Power BI reports. And don't worry, we will get into how do you actually build this app. Still just at the why should you care stage of things. The other way of sort of interacting and performing write-back is, well, what if I wanted to display this data not inside of the Power Apps visual, but I wanted to do it inside of my other visualizations, right? What if I wanted to have this data appear in one of my other visualizations? And you can also do that. This is another Power App that I built over here. The point is that if I select an item here, I can once again enter a new value and say Brandy's new email at email.com. And if I click this button, it will fire away and it'll throw this data to the Fabric SQL database. And then you'll notice that when I do this right now, this value will not change immediately. And that has to do with the way the Power BI model right now is set up to use direct lake rather than direct query. Direct lake does need a little bit of it's not completely live. Maybe some of you have heard this already, but there's a reframing process taking place behind the scenes, which means that Direct Lake is only almost live. So once this data has been landed in my backend in Fabric, if I'm using Direct Lake in my Power BI report, users will see a small delay before the data shows up here. If I'm lucky, it won't be many seconds before this shows up. I'll show you at the end of the session that this has indeed worked. But if you use direct query, and I'll get back to that later, this feedback will be live. So there are ways around this. Just know that absolute live write back and direct lake, they are not good friends. Finally, just flair. What is Microsoft Fabric? I like to always show that you can also build your own integrations towards ChatGPT and similar if that's what you want. But that's not really the focus of today. Today we are more concentrating about the write back portion here. All right. So just going back to the slides here. That was the why bother kind of presentation, right? The second story that I want to just take a step into, and let me actually just clean the canvas so you don't start reading without listening to me. We're mostly talking about Fabric SQL databases at the session today, but I would like to actually start the conversation by saying you don't need to use Fabric SQL databases if you are more comfortable using Fabric warehouses, or lakehouses can work as well, but I have a slide that shows you the pros and cons of each of these. So there are many ways to arrive at a decision about which backend in Fabric should you use, and I'll give you my 2 cents on why I prefer Fabric SQL databases myself. But the questions that you need to be asking yourself is stuff like, what are you trying to accomplish with your report right back? We kind of touched on the topic a little bit before, right? There was this whole discussion of how live does your data need to be in the Power BI report. Do you need instant feedback in other visualizations than the Power App itself? Well, that might impact your choice of backend for reasons I'll get back to in a second. Perhaps you need the write back data not to be shown in Power BI, but maybe you have dependencies elsewhere in your OneLake, in your Fabric environment that needs this data very live. It needs to get it immediately. That might also affect which backend artifact you choose in Fabric. Another consideration could be your technical competencies, right? If your developers, I mean, that's the story already for when you're building backend artifacts and Fabric data platforms. Are you choosing Lakehouse or Warehouse? That's often made to be a choice between Python preference or SQL preference, right? And you could say the same for SQL databases, of course, as they were just introduced. That, of course, also favors the SQL people, right? And finally, there's also perhaps a discussion about costs to be had, even though the write-back integration itself is not very costly by any means. Each of the backend artifacts, they behave slightly differently. And that's not the primary focus of the session today, but it's something you might want to keep in mind. So just to give you sort of the very quick rundown in terms of at least these key questions that I think are important to consider. When would you choose each of these backend situations? It's important to notice that if you care about the time it takes from your users inputting data in your write-back application until it lands within OneLake and becomes accessible for you to use in other applications or other parts of your platform, then SQL databases are frankly the worst choice. Because what happens really is that the data, when it arrives in the SQL database, it needs to go through a mirroring process before it lands in OneLake. And I'm being a little conservative here, saying that it takes about 1 minute. I think, frankly, it's a little faster than that, but I would rather be on the safe side when creating a slide like this. On the opposite side of things, when you write back from Power Apps to a data warehouse, it's instant. And when you write back to a lakehouse, it takes actually a couple of seconds. And the reason why it takes seconds is not because of, well, it's indirectly because of Fabric, that there is a difference between these two, but it has to do with how we perform the actual write back operation. And just to cover that very briefly, we can natively write back to SQL databases, we can write back to warehouses through stored procedures, and we can write back to Lakehouse using Power Automate. And that means when we trigger a stored procedure, that's instant. It's also instant with the native connector that we're going to see today with the SQL database. But as I said, the mirroring process takes a little bit of time. And for the Power Automate flow with the Lakehouse, that just takes a few seconds to kick off as well. So it's fast, but not as fast as the warehouse. If you care about the time it takes for the data to land at the report, well, frankly, that's the same across the board, basically. If you are okay with direct query as a storage format in your Power BI models, well, then the time it takes for the data to be reflected in the report is, well, basically zero. If you are using Direct Lake as a storage mode, it'll take up to, or maybe sometimes slightly more than a minute I've seen for this reframing process to happen. And on this slide should also be import as an alternative, right? In which case the time to report would be, well, however much time it takes to refresh your report and until your next refresh, of course. Now, one thing to note here is that, well, up until just a few weeks ago, it was impossible to combine Direct Lake with any of the other storage modes, right? So if you use Direct Lake for your Power BI report, you were kind of stuck with only that. But as of the latest Power BI update, and maybe you saw that at the Vegas conference, it's been announced a public preview of being able to connect to multiple different storage modes while using Direct Lake as well. So you could potentially have a whole data model that's using Direct Lake, and then have a single data table that you're doing write back to, which is using Direct Query if you want to do sort of instant write back feedback, but having the rest of your data model in Direct Lake. So it's very, very cool for this integration, but I haven't tested that out myself yet. The workarounds, I almost spoiled that a second ago, right? What workarounds are required for write-back to happen to each of these sources? Well, none for the SQL database. That works out of the box. For warehouses, we need to create stored procedures, and for lakehouses, we need Power Automate and some SQL, either through stored procedures or direct SQL injection. And then for sort of the cost side of things, well, I think there's some great people have already done a good analysis on cost comparisons between these artifacts in general. And I think the consensus is that SQL's databases are a little more expensive than the other two. But really the price difference that matters in this case, I think, is that you should know that the Lakehouse integration requires Power Automate licenses, right? Whereas the warehouse and SQL databases, they only require Power Apps licenses. And note that this is Power Apps Premium that is required, which I can never remember the pricing, but it depends a little whether you're using per user, per app, or have other sort of licensing. Maybe you have, I don't know, some good deal with Microsoft, but have a conversation with your IT department about those licenses. I think they're well worth their cost, $5-10 per user, right? Give or take. So I think what this boils down to, and why my preference goes a little like this, is that I tend to favor building solutions which have this direct feedback, in which I pull data direct query from the write back destination table. So I don't particularly care about the time it takes for the data to land in OneLake. I'm also more proficient in SQL than I am in Python. I don't think the cost downside of SQL databases are a problem. At least I'm lucky enough to work in an organization where we're not making our backend artifact decision, at least not for projects of this size, based on sort of that small difference. But more importantly, I think what you do need to have a conversation about, and where there could be an argument in this choice, is how does this artifact fit in the rest of your data platform architecture, right? It's, of course, if you have a policy in your organization that all of your backend artifacts in Fabric, they need to be warehouses because that's just how you work, then there are definitely ways to do that using those stored procedures that I'll also show that later today. So by no means is there never a scenario in which warehouses are just as good as SQL databases. I just think SQL databases are a little easier because of this native integration to Power Apps. I'll show in a second. Enough about sort of all the prep work. We have arrived at the conclusion that I at least prefer to use Fabric SQL databases as my backend artifact of choice whenever I need to write from Power Apps to Fabric, regardless of whether we're doing write back or just other interconnectivity. So how does this work? Let's try. So I pre-cooked a little, of course, like any good good consultant, and I went ahead and I created a database, a Fabric SQL database already. If you're in doubt how to do that, you just find yourself a workspace, right? Hit the new item, and you can search for your SQL database and create it like that. Once you're in your database, there are of course numerous ways to provide data. I just loaded in an AdventureWorks data table in this case. So I have some pretty standard data in here. And what you should know and notice is that, well, since I used a demo data set, this has already been set up for me. But if you do create your own model here, or use your own model, one thing you need to know for the native integration to work here for the SQL database, you need to ensure that there are primary keys enforced on the tables that you want to interact with. And just to give you an example of what that looks like, right? In this customer table, for example, I have an identity here that automatically increments by a single digit here on the customer ID, and this is a requirement for Power Apps to be able to interface this SQL database, and that's the same regardless of whether you're using a Fabric SQL database or an Azure SQL database or a third entire paradigm. So do note, you need to make sure that the tables that you're interfacing, they have a primary key, and you can do it like this with an identity, or you can create the primary key by other means. You can create a GUID, or you can even create the primary key yourself from Power Apps, but you need to ensure that that the primary key is added as a constraint to your table. All right. When that is said and done, the next step is that you need to find the endpoint of your SQL database to be able to open it in Power Apps. And unlike if you ever tried this with the warehouse lakehouses, in those cases, you would be hitting this cogwheel here, and you'd have like a SQL connection string. You don't in SQL database land. You have to click open in. You want to select the SQL Server Management Studio option. And then these two, the server name and database name, are the ones that you need to copy and use inside of Power Apps. So just to show you what that looks like, if I go into Power Apps here and click Create, let me just say start with a blank canvas. The way that we create such a connection is to let it load. If you've never seen the Power Apps interface before, this is the Canvas Designer Power Apps Studio, and the tree view here is where you add your components to the Power App. We'll spend a little more time in here trying to build a simple app in a second. But when you want to connect to a data source, you do that from the Data tab on the left-hand side. You click Add Data, and when you want to add a Fabric SQL database, it acts just like any other SQL server. So you, in Power Apps terms, so you just click, you search for SQL, find SQL Server. I've already logged in, but I still need to provide a server name and database name. Lo and behold, that's exactly what we had here. Just copy those real quick. If I click connect, you'll see I get all my tables and, importantly, all of my stored procedures as well. So from here, I can connect to my sales LT customer table. I can click my main container here and add a gallery. And as a source for my gallery, I could populate it with my sales LT customer table. And all of a sudden, I have Fabric data inside of my Power App. So that's kind of, the one way, right? We have now loaded Fabric data into our Power App. And this is how we can, pull information also about, we can create lookups to things that are not part of our Power BI model, right? I could connect to any number of things in here. But before diving more into this, I'll show you the integration from Power BI, because that's a different way of bringing Fabric data into this. But this was just to show you, this is how you create the connection to the Fabric SQL database, and how you actually perform the write back. I'll show you that at the next demo. But it was just to show you where to get all the connectivity info, highlighting the absolute need for a primary key, and then showing you how to set up that connection. All right, so that's how you do the actual connection, the integration between those two. Now, the next step is, well, how do we do this from within Power BI and do the Power App embedded inside of Power BI with a connection to the underlying Fabric model? So that's the next step. And instead of having all of this text, why don't we just go ahead and do this live instead? So I'm gonna jump back into my browser here, and I have again pre-cooked a little, but don't worry, we'll rebuild some of the stuff. I have here a very simple Power BI report, which is built on a Fabric SQL database. It loads a little bit of data from that table I just showed you before, the customer table from my Brightback database. So you'll see the data from inside this customer table, along with one of the facts is the basis of this table on the left-hand side. And just to put a few words on working with this integration, this is one of the few times where you'll ever hear anybody recommend you to work in the browser on creating Power BI reports. Frankly, it works much better than using a Power BI desktop, because you get a little bit of feedback when you build your app. You get some live feedback on whether you're building your integrations correctly. So take my word for it. You'll want to actually build this integration in the browser if you have the chance to do so. And that's just another reason to also leverage, of course, the Git integration of Fabric to make sure that your things are backed up and versioned correctly and everything, right? So I clicked Edit just to get into the edit mode of this browser. And the way I usually start with these applications is actually that I will build a table. I'll build a table visual containing the data that I want to send to my Power App, because that's why this integration works so beautifully. We can take any data that is part of our Power BI model and send in and use to filter the contents of our Power App. So you'll see right here, I have a data table with just the company name. And if I company name in the visualization on the left-hand side, my table gets filtered. And when I turn this table visualization into a Power Apps for Power BI visual, the same thing happens. If I don't click anything, my Power App would receive a list of all of the companies that you see here. If I select only a single one, then the list gets filtered and the Power App will filter as well. I'll show you how this works. So let's turn this into a Power Apps for Power BI visual. And if I had saved, if it hadn't been a Power Apps visual already, I would have gotten a chance to either create a new, let me show that, right? So if I add a new visual here and I add a company name to this, I get the chance now to either create a new app or choose an existing one. I can even switch between multiple environments if that's what I want. In this case, I'm already in the app I want to manipulate. From here, if you hit the three dots in the top right of the embedded visual here and click Edit, it'll actually open this embedded Power App in a new browser tab. And what's beautiful, and the reason why you want to create this integration or build this in the browser, is that, at least in theory, it should. Sometimes the connection breaks, but I should be able to, in the secondary Power Apps browser window, be able to see when I filter in the other tab. So if we're lucky and I select bulk discount store here, if I'm really lucky, it auto filtered over here. And you'll be able to see now that if I click on somewhere, I'll tell you a little bit more about the code. But if I show you the data that's being sent across here, you'll see that right now there's only one company name in this Power BI integration.data element. And if I remove my filter here, I'm not sure this worked. Maybe it did. You'll see that they are all there. So what's that about, right? So if I go into the data tab here, I have sales LT customer. I've connected to that same data table in my Brightback Fabric SQL database I showed you before. But actually in here, I'm not on this label. I'm actually not I'm not referencing this data source at all. Instead, I'm referencing Power BI integration.data. So instead of reading data from my Fabric SQL database, right now I'm actually reading data from my semantic model, from my Power BI report, by referencing this data object called Power BI integration. And this integration object it's only created once you open a Power App in edit mode from within Power BI. You can use an existing app, and then once you open it from in edit mode from Power BI, it'll create this object for you. Or when you create a new app from inside the visual with the button I showed you before, it'll also create this object. So here I'm able to see all the data that's currently in scope for my visual. And remember, this is just the table underneath the Power App, right? So had I added another column, I don't know if this will happen live. Sometimes it's a little slow with that. But if I add email address as well, theoretically in a second, that will appear as well. You see, this is just a table mirroring, well, but if it was a table underneath in Power BI. And I can now use, some Power FX. And of course, this requires familiarity with Power Apps. So I won't necessarily bore you with all the details. I'll expect you to be able to follow what I'm saying, but you will need to experiment a little by yourself, right? So what I'm doing here is just saying, well, for this label, a label in Power Apps cannot accept a full table as a data point. So I need to explicitly say, well, pick the first object in this data table and display the company name that's being selected. And what this means in the context of the Power BI report is that when nothing is being selected at all, the Power App will display alphabetically the first object inside of that Power BI integration.data table, even though there are many items in the table currently. And once I select something in the Power App, well, Action Bicycle Specialists will pop up because it's the only item in the table. So that's how you can filter your Power App from within Power BI by using Power BI integration and clever use of this little first formula. Well, okay, great. What if I wanted to change this company name, right? That's what we wanted to do. We wanted to do right back. I'm now a master data manager for AdventureWorks, and I know that Action Bicycle Specialists, they changed their name recently to Downhill Data Specialists, right? That's the name of the blog, shameless plug. So I created another text input here, and I made that blank. I don't have anything defaulted in here. So this is just a field that somebody can type something into, right? Downhill data. And then the magic, of course, happens on this save button. And this is where the integration to the SQL database comes into play and where that primary key matters. Because on this save button, I have a little bit more code, right? I have first and foremost, I could be using a patch statement as well, but I used an update if here. I'm saying, okay, look at this data connection I have to Fabric SQL Database and do a lookup and update company name. If there's already a company name with the name specified in the selected company name, override it with whatever is in my text input. And feel free to take a screenshot of this if this is a little convoluted. I hope the recording will be shared as well. I also have a blog that details all of this, so don't worry if you don't get a screenshot or don't get all of it. But this little piece of code actually overrides this piece of information in the database with this text right here. And then the last little bit of code is what's really interesting. This will force a visual refresh of the Power BI report after this action takes place. And that means that if you're using direct query, well, the user will not need to do anything in the Power BI report for this data to actually be integrated into the semantic model and show up. I'll show you what I mean. So I'm in the report here, and you can see I changed this previously. Let's actually change this again to Downhill Data Bicycle Store. And live demo gods and everything. If we're really lucky, when I press the save button, it'll take a second and you'll see this appear over here. Let's give it a shot. There we go. It worked. That was very live. That was, data being saved into the write-back database. I'm sure if we actually say select top 1000, if we are really lucky, company name, where is that? Maybe it takes a little too long to find, but somewhere in these 847 rows, there is now a store called Downhill Data Bicycle Store. Is this best practice? Should you be maintaining master data like this? Perhaps not. Perhaps not. But this was the easiest way to show you how easy it is to create this integration. And the sky is the limit here, right? You could be bulk editing stuff here. Some of the scenarios where you see this make the most sense, right, is for month-end closure in financial institutions. I've seen organizations where hundreds, thousands of people are typing in Excel spreadsheets every month, and they have to deliver them to finance by X due date, telling how many expenses they expect to have in the coming month. Something like that for financial planning purposes, right? Or maybe they need to go validate the expenses from the previous month. Something like that, but something with a deadline, right? And every time I see those scenarios with Excel spreadsheets, people miss their deadlines. Only a fraction of people will do that in time. some of the solutions we build a Power BI report that acts as like a to-do list for users. So they'll go through all of their items. Maybe it's invoices, maybe it's expenses, something like that. They'll go on each of them, and we'll have a little Power Apps interface that automatically picks up the information from the semantic model, looks up additional information from other source data dependent on the ID of the selected item. And then there's an input interface for the users to validate their inputs and type in the numbers, and then they can click submit, and they'll get a nice little check mark saying, well done, you did it, and it'll show the numbers in the report, and they can track their progress and all of that. You can set up reminders, with Power Automate to say, well, we are missing your input. You forgot to fill out all of your invoice information by the date. Please do this by tomorrow. It's very easy to build these integrations once you're in the Power Platform ecosystem and integrating that with Fabric. And if you want that whole live feedback and make this a little bit of an app-like experience for your users, Fabric SQL Databases with a direct query connection to that destination table is where it's at, frankly. I think now you've hopefully gotten a little inspiration. What does this look like? What kind of scenarios does this work for? But I'd like to just also add a couple of points of caution, right? What are some of the limitations and considerations you should keep in mind when working with embedded Power Apps? And I'll be the first to say that, for example, CI/CD and embedded Power Apps and Power BI are not best friends. It can be done, but if you're ever in a situation where you need to have both your Power App and your Power BI report and your Fabric SQL database go through development, test, production, or however many deployment stages you have, you're going to have it's possible if you use custom code pipelines as your DevOps pipelines, but there's no native way to deploy your Power App simultaneously to you deploying your Power BI report natively within either of these product suites. It's not easy to do. That's the point of this, although it can be done. Maybe you already noticed this when I showed you the Power App I just made. We have these ugly black borders, right? These are hard to get rid of. I can resize this, but it's very, very hard to get pixel perfect stuff, even if you go into formatting and you start changing these things. When I open this report on another monitor, I might have a black border somewhere. And some of it sure has to do with automatic resizing of Power BI reports, and you can disable that too. And I mean, there are tons of things you can try, but the fact is, it rarely works perfectly. I've even seen that sometimes a Power App becomes blurry when seen on one person's monitor. I'm like, what the heck? It's the same resolution, but that's just they're a little weird like that. So if you really, really care about the visual layout, be careful when using embedded Power Apps and Power BI. Of course, this kind of solution architecture adds a lot of complexity, right, to your solutions in general. Maybe you were happy about the license consolidation of Fabric, right? No more Azure cost tracking. Well, probably some, but likely less, right? Maybe you bought an F64 and don't need to worry too much about user licenses outside of your developers. Well, now you're introducing Power Platform licenses to the mix. Power Apps Premium if you're working with Fabric SQL databases or Fabric data warehouses, and even Power Automate Premium if you need to interface lakehouses. So that's also something to consider. Then there are some technical limitations. I showed you before that I had a data table of here. Well, I showed you in the database that we had 847 different customer names. And when I haven't selected anything in my Power BI report, there will be 847 items in my table here. Had I selected a dimension with more than 1,000 values, and I needed to in some way index all of those, Power Apps would only load the first 1,000 rows that comes in. And often you don't need to load more than 1,000 items from a dimension at once. You would usually ask your users to filter, or you can do some tricks Power App side to circumvent this. I have a couple of tricks up my sleeve as well that I can show you depending on the time. But just be aware that there's a default limit that the table underneath this Power Apps visual will only accept 1,000 rows of data. I have also seen trouble with the memory of the Power App when adding too many columns. But there's no fixed limit. That's a bit trial and error. If you have columns with very high cardinality, large string values, hundreds of characters, thousands of characters even, and you bring many of those into Power Apps at once, you might face trouble. And in addition to that, I mean, underneath the hood, as I said, it is just a table visual. And as you know, table visualizations in Power BI are slow. So if you're using DAX measures, because you can do that too, there's nothing stopping me from, I don't have any measures here, but I can add measures to my Power Apps visual as well. But if those measures, they are not optimized, if they're very poor, has some crazy, I don't know, X formula logic going on, row by row calculations that are not optimized. Well, just like if it was a Power BI table, the app will be slow as well. So those considerations and limitations still apply for this Power BI visual as it would any other Power BI visual. But the 1,000 row limit, that's a little hidden gem that you'll find when you dig through the documentation. We're running full speed ahead here. And the reason for that is because I do want to just get to these advanced integrations just to show you a little more potential for what are some other crazy things we can do with embedded Power Apps and using our integration with the Fabric SQL database. And I'm just going to, rapid fire a little here without necessarily going into very deep detail here. So one thing I wanted to just share with you is a pretty common scenario is that you'll need the same Power App in more than one Power BI report, but maybe you need it to behave slightly different. And there could be many reasons for that, right? So recently I built an app for a pharmaceutical company in which you have people employed by the medical division and the sales division. The salespeople, they need to be able to see sales numbers and stuff inside of their Power BI report and inside of the Power App. And the medical people, the research people, they're not allowed to see that sales data, neither within the Power App nor within the Power BI report. But they needed to use a Power App that was functionally the same. So how can we do that? Well, of course, I can create two identical Power BI reports and put two Power Apps visualizations inside of each of these reports. But how do I get them to then behave slightly differently without making a copy of my app? And there are ways to do that. So let me just boot this up right here. What you can do is that you can use the fact that I teased it just before. You can use calculated measures in your Power Apps embedded visualizations as well. So here I have a semantic model where I have a hard-coded measure that returns the value 1, and I'm using that inside of my Power App to determine which landing screen or which starting screen my users are being directed to. So I have a secondary report. Let me just open that actually. Somewhere in here, embedded Power Apps, secondary embedded report. I should have, and this measure, by the way, is just created in DAX, right? I just say hard-coded measure equal 1 inside of the semantic model. And here you'll see I have a hard-coded measure that says equals 2. I also have a dynamic measure, and we'll get back to that in a second. But what I've done in the Power App, if I open this in edit mode, is that I've added a timer to my front page, which has a duration that's very minuscule. And then dependent on the value of this hard-coded measure, I'm using an if statement, an if formula, like you know from DAX or from Excel, right? And I'm checking what's the value of M hard-coded measure. And whether that's a 1 or a 2 is going to determine the behavior of the Power App. Okay, sign in. Let's see if that works. Takes a second. It's the worst when you forget to open a window of something you want to demo, right? So I have a default welcome screen here, and I've added a Power Apps control here, a timer, which has a duration of 600 milliseconds. And on timer end, it checks from the semantic model, right? From the visual, the data being sent from the visual, what's the value of M hard-coded measure? And if the value is 2, then it navigates to a secondary page. So on my first report here, where the value is 1, I see the front page. And if I just reload this, you'll see that it'll auto navigate without me touching the mouse at all. It'll auto navigate the user to that secondary screen. And I can, of course, do this in a little more elegant way, making the timer much shorter and stuff like that. But that's one way you could do it. If some of you are familiar with Power Apps, you might be asking yourself right now, well, Jon, are you stupid? Why don't you just use the start screen property of your Power App, which in theory, when you open a Power App, will let you do stuff like that, check a data source? Well, the trouble is Power BI integration.data is loaded after the start screen property is being checked. So if any of you were wondering if you could use this instead of a timer, unfortunately, you cannot do that right now. Just wanted to address that. Okay, the next thing here, I also have a dynamic measure here, and this is based on row level security. So maybe you have a single Power BI report and not two different Power BI reports, but a single Power BI report where you use dynamic row level security to, depending on the logged in user's username, you are allowing them to see, only parts of the data. And maybe you want this security logic in your model to pass through to your Power App. Well, one way of doing that is to create a calculated measure that returns the result of your row level security logic and pass that as well. So here I have an admin button. And if I go in here and click calculated measures, I don't have an admin button. Guess what? The way that works is just that on the admin button, and now everything is failing in here. I'm not sure why, but you can see the logic anyway. If Power BI integration.data.m dynamic measure equals 1, and the hard-coded measure equals 2. I'm not sure why I needed that logic. Maybe my demo failed if I didn't. But you can see I can just add a check here on the visible property of a button to control, show, hide. Some users need to be able to see this, and other users need to be able to see that. And I can reuse the logic from my row level security if I'm able to output that into something I can interpret in here. It doesn't need to be a measure that returns a number. It could be a role, right? I could say if M user role equals CEO, then visible or something like that, right? Whatever I can do with DAX, I can pick it up through this Power BI integration.data element. So that's super powerful. And then I can see here, now's the time. I'm totally skipping my slides just to show you all of the cool stuff you can do, right? I told you about that 1,000 row limitation of the Power Apps visual. Well, there is actually a workaround. So right here, you'll see I have a dropdown. I wanted to take data from my semantic model and populate a filter in the Power App, because you can, of course, build filters in your Power App as well. It doesn't need to be in the Power BI report. And here I have, at the dimension table in which city name appears as probably taken from the fact, just to show you the demo. But the fact is I'm only able to see 4 different data points here, because there are more than 1,000 rows of data in this table underneath here. I have a secondary dropdown here in which, now it didn't work. In theory, if this had worked, you would be able to see all of the different options here. For some reason, my demo broke for this one. But the idea is you can create this is why I have a selection here. I'll clear the selection. Now you see all of them, right? And this one will only go down to York. If I select some of these, you'll even see this one, that only shows the B ones, and this one will be able to show all of them. The point is, I have a DAX measure here in which I concatenate. I'm using concatenate X to create a long string. I told you to be aware of sending long strings to Power Apps. You can do it as long as it's not too many, but you can, and this will allow you to pass this data out inside of the Power App if you so wish, by using some split logic and some sorting to sort of split that apart. So there are ways to circumvent that 1,000 row limit. To make sure we have time for questions, I'll show you a final trick here that has to do with the stored procedures that I teased in the beginning, just to show you what does this look like if I want to interface a Fabric data warehouse as well. And the way that this works, let me just here go back to the Sprog warehouse. I have a Fabric data warehouse here. I could do this, however, in a Fabric SQL database as well. They also support stored procedures. And inside of my DBO schema here, I've created a couple of stored procedures. Most importantly, I have a stored procedure here called insert sales from JSON, which accepts a JSON parameter and then inserts that into a sales data table. It uses a little bit of open JSON logic to pass that out. What that means is if I build a Power App in which I can create a data table, just go back here, store procedures. So I have here a little bit of Power Apps magic, right? I'm creating a collection here of 500 randomly generated records. Then I have a save button here, which, because it's a data warehouse we're interfacing, I'm not able to write data just by referencing the table name of the warehouse itself. It will come up with an error that says something nondescript, which when translated means this table doesn't have enforced primary keys. And the reason for that is you can't do that in Fabric data warehouses. The primary reason why I prefer SQL databases. But you can call stored procedures. If you went into the whole, as I showed you at the beginning, connecting to the SQL server, you could add a stored procedure, and I can interface my insert sales from JSON. I can insert this stored procedure and reference it. And now I just take the collection of records in my gallery, format it as JSON, and I can save all of this data to my data table. And well, I mean, that fired away in less than a second. And now these 500 records were bulk created, bulk inserted inside of my Fabric data warehouse in a split second. I could have done that with my Fabric SQL database too. And this is frankly excellent, regardless of whether you're using the database or the warehouse when doing bulk CRUD operations. You could not create 500 records with the native connector in less than a minute. It would simply spin for a minute before being done. Now, just to add another layer to this, I also have a snapshot store procedure that takes everything in the table I just wrote to here and saves it in a history table. So if I click the snapshot button, it'll right now, or before I click this before, there were 3,000 records in my history table. And if I click the snapshot button, it'll fire my, where is that? Snapshot sales data. I have another stored procedure here that just takes everything that's in sales data and inserts it into sales data history. And what I wanted to show you here is just that if I just reload this, you'll see there's now 8,000 records. Apparently there was, I think I inserted more than 500 just a second ago. But it basically appended everything in one table and added it to the other. The last trick that I wanted to show you, which I already showed, is that, well, if any of you are familiar with Power Apps in general already, you're likely familiar with the Power Apps limitation that Power Apps can usually only read 500 or 2,000 records if you change in the settings, 2,000 records from the data source you're interfacing, which means that a gallery will also usually only be able to contain up to 2,000 records. Well, here I have a row count that just counts the number of rows in my gallery, and that's up to 8,000 now. So how did I display 8,000 records in my Power App without breaking a sweat? Well, I'm using another stored procedure with a result set and output the result set in my Power Apps gallery. So if I go into my database again, just to show you what it looks like, I have a get sales data. And this one simply has two different result sets, two different select statements. One takes the sales data and the other takes the sales data history. I can toggle between the two by changing from table 1 to table 2 here, right? So now, okay, there are 5,000 records apparently inside of my sales data table. And that's why it went up to 8,000, right? Because it added 5 to the 3 that were already in my snapshot table. Change that back to table 2, and there's still 8,000 records. Let's just snapshot once more. It's done. Let's see what's now there. Was a little fast there. Table 1 and table 2. 13,000. There you go. Displaying 13,000 records in the Power Apps gallery. That's probably not what you expected to see today because the topic was Fabric SQL databases, but this is only possible because it's been it's only as of last year that it's so easy to call stored procedures directly from your Power Apps. So this integration is how you put your write back on steroids when you want to do bulk record creation, editing, deletion, all of that together, and really create a powerful write back application for your Fabric backend. That was actually all of my demos. I just decided to skip the slides, right? Before we end off the session with taking some questions, I did just want to revisit this slide just to give you the link to my LinkedIn again and to my blog. if anybody wants to connect, have questions, if you're concerned about something that I showed you today, or think that this session was cool and you'd like to have it featured at your conference, what do I know, right? Reach out. I'd love to get in touch.